The Heap, Marsh of Forgotten Men. 1. The marsh takes what the world throws away. Hear me. There is a place beyond the town limits where the river widens and loses its name, a spread of cattail and peat where the ground remembers everything that dies upon it. At dawn, the fog sits low as a penitent. Herons stand like wounded saints. Dragonflies stitch the morning together, one blue thread at a time. If you step wrong, the earth does not protest. It simply swallows. On such ground, even a whisper has weight, a promise, a curse, a vow to return. On such ground, a man can become something else. They say the first time anyone saw the thing, it rose out of the water without ripples, as if even the river feared to touch it. It was taller than a door, broader than a bear, and dressed not in fabrics, but in the green-black tatters of the marsh itself, rotting weeds, lake moss, and the tilled-up roots of forgotten willows. A slope of a head with no lips, no eyes you could swear to, and yet you felt yourself watched by an old, sorrowing intelligence. You felt judged, and you could not say why. They call it many names when they are brave. In whispers, when the lamps are low and the children are finally asleep, they call it the Heap. But you cannot understand the Heap without understanding what the marsh remembers. Let me tell you how the marsh learned his name. 2. Snow, fire, and the vow no one heard. Long before that river upped stakes and moved to America, long before the factory lights came like false stars, there was another marsh, colder, meaner, a black fen in a country whose map kept changing color. The winter of war had frozen it into something that looked like land, and that lie killed a lot of men. A man fell out of the sky into that fen. His plane was a cinder by the time it hit, a broken match falling through broken weather. He had a name once. He wore it stitched over his heart. He smelled of engine oil, cigarettes, and fear. His last good act as a man was to turn the nose of that dying machine away from a village he had never seen before, from a woman in a blue headscarf carrying water, from a boy running after a dog. He gave his life to save strangers, which is another way of saying he paid off an old debt no one but him remembered. The marsh took him. The cold took him. The peat wrapped around bone and silk, leather and thought, and did what marshes do, kept the story from finishing. It remembered the heat of his hands, the way he whispered an apology in a language that was not his first. It stored all of that in the black agenda of its own mud, and something changed. Things rot. That is their privilege. But sometimes rot fuses what was separate. Sometimes death is a kind of solder. In time, a body rose that was not a man and not the marsh, but both. A sluggish awakening. A fist that had never been a fist dragging itself through reeds and warted lily pads. A mouth that did not breathe opening to the taste of war on the air. It tried a sound, and the marsh answered with bubbles. It tried a step, and the marsh did not let it fall. He had a thought then. One thin glass bell inside a cathedral of mud. I turned the flame from them. The bell rang without words. He had no eyes, but he saw the sky in the frog's reflection, pale, haunted, infinite. He took a step, then another. The marsh watched its child go. 3. The river that forgot its name. Decades moved, like the long line of ants that harvest sorrow. The war ended on paper and kept muttering in the hearts of men. Ships emptied their human cargo into countries that promised more than they could hold. A river who had once sipped the black fen found itself braided with others, domesticating itself through cities, mills, and dams, arriving at last where the land leveled and people built a town they named Cedar Hollow. Cedar Hollow was a place of popcorn, Saturdays, and neon beer signs, of church bells and the whistle at the cannery. The cannery changed hands and names until a man named Harrow bought it and gave it teeth. He rebranded it, Harrow Chemical and Pulp. A different kind of cannery now. This one dined on forests and spat out paper, bleached the color out of pulp with whites so bright they felt like lies. At night, under the good American stars, the factory let its ghosts out into the water, and the river carried them because that is what rivers do. Down past the bend where the lights gave up, the ghosts learned to gather. They found the old, slow heart of a marsh and hid there. On a wet night, after a thunderstorm peeled back the sky and stitched it sloppy, a boy named Jamie moved along the levee with a pronged stick. He hunted night crawlers and hoped for the kind of trouble he could talk about later. He peered down and saw what he thought was a drowned scarecrow. Then the scarecrow breathed. Jamie did not scream. He swallowed the sound and made another. "Mister?" The thing was not a mister. It rose, moss dripping, reeds rattling, a pile of graveyard stories finding its feet. It lifted what might be a face toward the boy and stopped, as if remembering something soft. Swamp water ran off it like tears. "Are you lost?" Jamie said absurdly, because even as adults we say absurd things when our souls are trying to run. The boy stood his ground because sometimes bravery is a thing boys do by accident. The Heap leaned toward him, listening the way trees listen. There was no language in that gaze, only a pressure, like weather moving in. The boy's nightcrawler tin clattered to the mud. The Heap moved a mass of braided weeds that could have been an arm and crouched with a patience that made the frogs go quiet. A flashlight beam slashed the marsh from the trail above. "Jamie? You blind little fool! Get back from there!" a man's voice snapped. Boots slid, curses followed, and the light found the Heap's face. The man fired his shotgun without aiming. That was his first mistake. The second was to look after. The Heap did not roar. It did not flinch. It stepped between the boy and the gun the way a stone steps between rain and the ground, and the shot peppered it pointlessly. The pellets sunk and vanished, the way small evils do in a world already soaked with larger ones. The Heap turned and melted into cattail and shadow, shouldering itself back into its element without hurry, without hate. The river closed its mouth over the sound of it and went on pretending it was the only thing that had ever lived here. Jamie dreamed of moss for a week. He woke with the taste of iron and pond mint in his mouth. He said nothing to anyone, the way boys keep their miracles hostage. But miracles are only miracles until they are counted. Then they become something else: evidence, rumor, motive. 4. Harrow counts his ghosts. Mr. Harrow was pale the way paper is pale. He kept his hair too oiled and his shirts too crisp. He fed the town the way a farmer feeds the cattle in the weeks before market, well, loudly, with speeches and public dinners. He funded the new church bell. He funded Halloween candy for the children, and twice sponsored a Little League team that never won a game. He grinned handsomely and shook hands in such a way that the other man always wondered what he had lost. Mr. Harrow was also dumping poison into the river at night to save himself the price of a cleaner conscience. The river took it, and the marsh stored it, and the fish forgot their songs. If you walked past Harrow Chemical and Pulp late enough, you'd see the loading bay humped with drums that had stencils that meant nothing to anyone without the right book in their pocket. If you followed the hollow laughter of men with nowhere else to go, you'd find a fire barrel behind the bay and two pink-faced foremen playing cards while the night shift wheeled drums down to a culvert that fed a ditch that fed a small, dark mouth of water. The only person who noticed in an official capacity was a young woman named Mara Keene, who wrote for the county paper because she preferred her lies printed and paid for. Mara smelled a story. She also smelled the bleach when the wind hit wrong. She coughed for half the drive home and dreamed in white. She began to watch the marsh. So did others. Men with flashlights and guns. Boys with rocks because boys have always tried to make sense of fear with something thrown. Women who watched because their men would not listen to the words, "It's wrong." A preacher who suspected a demon where there was only a man too old to remember he had been one. On the 5th night after Jamie saw the heap, a barge came slow and secret around a bend with no name, and tied off where the marsh deepened. Rain threaded the world together from sky to mud. The foreman cursed the weight and rolled 2 drums down planks so slick they looked like sins. One drum slipped. It cracked where no one heard it. The river heard it. The marsh wrote the sound down in its black ledger. When the men left, the river sighed a little, like a tired animal. The heap came. It did not walk like men walk. It moved with the sure slowness of the old, the rhythm of weather. It paused at the drum as if it knew something that did not include words. It pushed its arm, root, muscle, mud, against the seam until the lid caved. A white smell rose that had no right to wear a color. The cattails bent away in apology. The heap bent and put itself between that sickness and the river mouth. It held, with no muscle meant for holding. It held for a long time. Across the marsh, a heron lifted and left, because some griefs do not ask permission to arrive. When dawn found the marsh, the drum lay empty, and the heap lay stretched along the bank like a blasted stump. If you had a heart and you saw it, you would have put your hand to your mouth and whispered, "Oh," because pity is an old habit. The heap rose by inches. It left a mark in the mud the shape of a man crucified. Sometimes the world saves itself with a thing it has no word for. Sometimes that thing pays forever. 5. Broken mirrors. Mara Keene came at noon in rubber boots and a stubborn raincoat that had been yellow once. She took photographs, the collapsed drum, the white stain in the mud where nothing should be white, the hoof tracks of a thing with too many toes that were, if you squinted, not toes at all, but rotted fingers swollen with rain. She followed the trail, not because it made sense, but because she believed that if she stopped believing in stories, the world would stop making them. She found the place where the reeds had been pressed down into a bed. She found the print of a palm in the sediment, a left hand larger than any man's by a third, with a deep crease at the base of the thumb that made her heart hurt, because it was so human. She did not see the heap watching her. The marsh covered him with its old compassion. Far off, the cannery whistle blew. Then another horn answered, the ship's horn from the river, where men hauled what needed hauling and hid what needed hiding. Mara wrote down names, times, the way the river looked guilty when it tried to act innocent. That night, the boys came with rocks, not Jamie. Jamie sat in his room with the windows closed and the covers pushed down to his feet. He thought if he kept himself honest, the world might return the favor. But boys are not deputized by their own conscience, and other boys came to do what boys do when given a target and permission. They went down to the marsh in a clutch of giggles that sounded like dogs when they've cornered something smaller. They ditched their bikes at the broken fence by the old pumping station and walked on the boards their grandfathers had laid down long ago to make the mud crossable. They threw the first rock into water they believed was just water. The heap lifted. There is a sound mud makes when it lets go, a long kiss. The boys froze in a pantomime of statues. One of them, Dale or Ray, a hat pulled low like crime, found his courage by lighting it on fire. He hurled another, and the sound of rock hitting the heap is one you never forget, because it sounds like you've just won and then realize you have struck a thing that will outlive you. The heap did not chase them. It stooped. It did something no man would have thought to do. It picked up the rocks one by one and filled a hole in the riverbank where the water had chewed at the earth. It made the shore secure. The boys stopped, confused in the good way. Some stories end there, with shame learning to become decency. This was not that story. Someone else had come to the marsh while boys tested their hands against fear. Men with flashlights and the idea that anything that is not a man must be less than a man. The sheriff was there because the mayor said so and because Mr. Harrow had stopped by that morning with a donation envelope that had a heartbeat. "Hold your fire," the sheriff whispered, because he knew a part of the law the others had forgotten. But a deputy with new boots and no patience fired anyway. The slug went into the heap's middle and did what slugs do in a world that is already broken. It lodged, made nothing better, and increased the general amount of anger. The heap did not roar. You keep expecting a roar. Instead, something like a low wind happened. The reeds leaned, the cattails nodded, the frogs' throats drummed. The heap moved its bulk between the boys and the guns again, in a habit it had learned in another lifetime. Put the body in the way of the fire. Mara's voice came sharp from the cattails. "Stop! For God's sake, stop! Look at what it's doing!" No one looked. They fired again, because sometimes you cannot tell the difference between being brave and being loud. The heap turned and slipped into shadow. The marsh heeled over its passage like a dream heels when you wake. The boys ran, crying from bravado and a sudden taste of their own softness. The men shouted and tried to knit a story out of pride and gunpowder. A monster fled. They put it to flight. They kept the town safe. They were owed something. Mr. Harrow watched from the levee with eyes like receipts. "Get me that thing's head," he said in a voice lower than his public one, the voice the mirror hears when he practices smiling. 6. The woman in the blue headscarf. She came to town on a bus that sighed like a tired horse. She carried a suitcase the color of old bruises and wore a scarf the color of a sky someone had liked and tried to paint, but ran out of paint. Her name was Katya, though she answered to Miss and Ma'am and you there without flinching. She had lived in countries where the wrong reply cost more than money. She rented a room above the diner and took a job washing dishes until her hands went the color of ghosts. She walked by the river in the evenings because water knows words in every language and sometimes says them back. On her third evening, she stood at the marsh's lip and hummed a song her grandmother taught her, not a hymn, not a lullaby, but something in between, meant to bless the edges of things so they don't slice you. The heap was already there. It had been there all day, half submerged where the deeper channel cooled its pain. The wind shifted. The scent of soap and onion skin and old train coal drifted. The song arrived, a small boat. The heap turned its blank face toward her. The song went on. Katya did not smile. She did not scream. She lifted her chin the smallest amount and kept singing, because to stop would have admitted fear, and fear is a currency she paid in only when necessary. Memories do strange things in the mud. The old bell inside the heap, that glass remnant of a cockpit and a decision, rang once. He remembered turning fire from a woman in a blue headscarf he had never met. He remembered the promise a man makes to no one out loud. "I will keep harm from the shore." He sank lower. The song ended. Katya did not tell anyone about the moment, because some moments demand to be kept warm in the body until they hatch. But she told Mara quietly over coffee, because sometimes women recognize in each other the need for a second pair of eyes. Mara wrote nothing down. She listened with her journalist's hands around her cup like she was keeping a bird from flying away. When Katya finished, Mara said, "Then I'm not crazy," which is what all good reporters say at least once a week. She resolved to go back that night with a camera and a friend. She did not have a friend she trusted to come, so she went alone. 7. A saint with no altar. You would think, by now, that the town would divide itself neatly. Believers in the heap's goodness on one side, believers in its monstrosity on the other. But people aren't coins. They don't land heads or tails. They roll. By day, Harrow's men hunted. They wore waders and carried rifles a little too expensive for what they were hunting. They swore and spat and pretended the marsh made them feel large. They shot at reeds that moved and bragged about blood they never found. At night, they rolled drums. They never stopped doing one while they talked about the other, and in that hypocrisy is a whole semester of civics. The preacher preached. He found the heap in Leviticus, in Revelation, in the book of things men don't understand and so fear. He beat his Bible hard enough to wake the dead who had buried themselves in it for peace. "Mark it," he told his flock. "Mark that thing for the fires of judgment." The flock took the instruction and turned it into something easier. Bring oil. Bring matches. Bring the feeling that comes when you and your neighbors agree to do something terrible together. Jamie watched from his bedroom window and prayed in the language of boys. Don't let the dumb grown-ups win. Katya washed dishes. She hummed. She set a saucer of milk out by the back step not for cats. There were none worth feeding. But for a superstition so old, it did not require justification. Mara sat awake with her notebook open to a page whose title was her only prayer. Make it matter. And the heap moved. It stalked the edges of the marsh not with a predator's hunger, but with a caretaker's fatigue. Plugging holes the water dug, lifting trash no water deserved to hold, bending bent things back toward their own true shapes. When a doe broke her leg at the sluice gate, the heap stood still enough for her to lean on it, and still enough to let her die. It covered her with reeds. When a man with liquor in his legs stumbled off the boardwalk and into the black water, the heap lifted him out by his coat like a wet child and laid him on the grass, then faded back while the man coughed up the river. The man woke, saw the shape retreating, and told everyone who would listen that a demon tried to drown him and that he fought it off, which is how a lot of stories survive. He had raffle tickets in his pocket from the church. 8. Fire loves old wood. We could have stopped it a dozen ways. Don't tell me we couldn't. We have always known how to hold back fire, by water, by sense, by the tired mothers of this world putting their bodies in doorways and saying, no farther. But we were busy. Harrow decided that a spectacle was required. He could not have his men tell stories of a thing that shrugged off bullets and made fools of them. He could not have Mara's camera find him in the fall of a drum. He called a meeting of the concerned, which is the most dangerous kind of town meeting. He promised to fund a new playground. He promised to underwrite the winter coats for children who would never be warm again after this. He promised, with clean fingers, that he would bring the men and the fuel, and all the town had to do was bring its fear. They brought it like a picnic. At dusk, they lit torches, because a flashlight does not look like righteousness. Men stood with post-hole diggers, and women stood with their mouths in hard lines, and boys swung their arms too much because they did not know what to do with the energy in them. The preacher prayed a prayer with a hole in it, and some of the women fell in. Mara stood at the edge, her camera in her hands, and something near her ribs that wanted to break. But she stayed. A reporter's sin and gift. She wanted to witness. They made a ring of fire in the marsh. If you have never tried to corral a swamp with flame, you have not yet committed the kind of sin that feels clever at the time. They poured fuel on the old grass, and the grass accepted it the way an old drunk accepts company. Fire went up like a choir. The heap came because it had to. It walked into the ring with the patience of stones and the memory of snow in its core. The fire found it, and the smell that rose was not meant for human lungs. Men fell back. Women put air against their teeth and held it. The fire licked, learned, tried again. The heap did not run. It bent toward the lowest, dampest spot and put its bulk there, making a bridge for the small things, the mice, the snakes, the frogs, the almost birds. Shoot it, someone said, sick with the need to turn this into something they recognized. Don't, Mara said, but she was one voice, and the others were a choir of torches. Jamie ran through the legs of grown men, not sensing or caring about the hands that tried to keep him. He ran to the ring and screamed, "Stop it! It's helping! Get that boy!" the preacher cried, and in the confusion, no one noticed the smallest thing, a flare of flame that leapt from torch to reed, reed to boardwalk, boardwalk to the old pumping station, a building so dry you could have lit your cigarette on its shadow. The pumping station woke up as a bonfire. Its roof coughed sparks into the sky. Someone yelled, "The river!" And another yelled, "No!" because they thought the chemicals might kiss the water and the water might carry their crime to their fishermen. Katya was the only one who moved toward the fire. She ran in that headscarf like flag, not thinking, just counting the steps. 8 to the door, 3 to the valves, 5 to the wheel. She had turned harder things than wheels. She had turned men back from doorways. She turned the wheel. The pump groaned, then caught, sending river water through a throat it had not used in years. Water met fire and did what lovers do when reunited after too long. They turned the world to steam. The heap moved into the choking, generous fog without fear. Fire crawled up its body and laid down, a spent dog. Steam broke apart and reassembled into prayer. The heap lifted beams that used to be a roof and laid them where men could drag them. It stood between a line of women passing buckets and a sheet of flame waving like a fever. Someone, one of Harrow's men, one of anybody's, fired at the heap because he could not stand to see what he had come to hate be useful. The shot struck that old seam wound, the slug from the deputy's gun that had not healed because some bullets stay like winter in a bone. The old wound opened. Something inside the heap that had remembered snow and a bell and a vow gave way. The heap staggered like a saint shot down in a stained glass window. It saw, do not ask me how it saw, Katya on the catwalk, the metal under her feet glowing like the memory of a furnace. The catwalk buckled. She fell. The heap crossed the distance in a sentence with no commas. It caught her. She could not breathe. The world smelled like a burned prayer. She put her hand to what should have been a cheek and whispered a word no one heard, not even herself. It might have been, "Thank you." It might have been a name. It was a sound round enough to roll down the years and find what needed finding. The catwalk tore with a sudden, tired sound. The heap lifted Katya bodily and pressed her into the arms of men becoming useful, their hands learning to hold without harm. Then it turned back to the fire. Not because anyone asked, but because it had an old habit. Put the body where the harm is. And the pumping station fell. The heap took it. It did not move. Beams the color of old tobacco met the mass of mud and root and reed, and found it kinder than they had any right to be. The water hissed. The steam wrote unreadable letters in the air, and the wind carried them to the church where no one could translate. Fire died finally, full of its own story. When the smoke thinned, the townsfolk saw a hill where the pumping station had stood. A mound of black and green, a shape too still to be alive, a saint with no altar. The marsh was quiet the way cut rooms are quiet. 9. A trial without a judge. You would think the town would kneel. You would think they would lay their hands on the dark mound and confess the smallness in them that had begged fire to make them big. Some did. Not enough. Harrow's men moved the beams with crowbars and curses because they could not afford to let this story be the one it clearly was. They uncovered the heap in pieces, like an archaeology of shame. An arm that was not an arm, a slope of a head against which no bullet had ever been brave, the wound at the center where their fear had gone in and lodged. "No waste," Harrow said to the sheriff quietly. "No story." The thing attacked. We fought. We saved the town. Write it that way. It will print. Mara said, "I have pictures." She had taken them in the steam, in the firelight, in the frantic, generous confusion. The sheriff, an old man with a son who still hadn't come home from a different war, looked at her with the kind of tired that cannot be slept off. "Miss Keene," he said, "you do what you have to." I don't know any more what that is. Katya knelt by the heap and did not touch it. She put her palm on the mud near its shoulder, perhaps, and sang a song half under her breath. She had no illusions about men or monsters. Her scarf was scorched, A corner had gone to ash and floated up to become part of a story someone else would tell. She did not cry. She pushed the tears back to where she kept her winter. Jamie stood with his hands in fists at his sides, and his mouth made a line even his mother would not have recognized. He was 13, and he learned 13's lesson, that adults can be each other's alibi. The Heap did not move. They brought chains because men always bring chains to the aftermath of things they fear. They brought lengths of winch cable and a truck from Harrow's yard. They slipped the cables under the Heap and tried to drag it, the way men try to drag their guilt. The truck's engine labored, the cables sang, the Heap moved an inch, two, then stopped as the mud reclaimed it in loyalty. "Bury it," Harrow said, shrill for the first time in years. "No," Katya said. He smiled at her the way a man smiles at a stray that hasn't learned the rules. "Miss, the men are working." "Bury him! You bury yourselves!" she said. Her accent thickened over the words like frost. "Get her out of here," Harrow said to no one in particular. No one moved. There are moments when the town's nervous system misfires and does something decent by accident. This was one. The sheriff looked at his boots and said, "Let the marsh have him." It sounded like defeat. It was mercy. They took off the cables. They left the Heap on the smoking ground while the marsh seeped up around it. Soft hands, a cradle made of the world's first bed. The river lapped at ash and swallowed it because rivers are old and know their duties. The fog came down, laid itself over the scene like a sheet over a body. By morning, the Heap was gone. In its place was a hollow warm with water, a place frogs dared to own, a place that would, in a season, grow a ring of cattails so tall you could hide behind them and finally feel safe. 10. The truth that lives in mud. Harrow called the paper. He called the mayor. He called a lawyer who did not sleep well and a clergyman who slept too well. He made a statement and then another, and each had less truth than the one before. He cut a ribbon on a playground and made sure the newspapers put the photo above the fold. Mara's editor killed her story that first week. "We print what keeps the lights on," he said. Mara quit on a Thursday afternoon that smelled like pencils. She started her own sheet that Friday, mimeographed and stapled by hand, given out in front of the diner for free. The first page, a picture of the Heap's hand against the mud with the caption, "Who saved us?" People took it because all thefts are tempting, even those paid for. Jamie skipped 2 days of school and went to the marsh. He brought a lunch in a paper sack and left the food by the place where the Heap had been. That night, a stray dog ate it, and Jamie did not mind. The third day, he found a new thing. Reeds braided together across the ditch where the river tried every year to take a bite out of the road. The braid was ugly and strong. Someone had made it with bad fingers and good intent. Jamie smiled. He didn't tell anyone because boys know that keeping a miracle quiet makes it last longer. Katya wrote a letter to no one and did not send it. It began, "You would have liked him." It ended with a song. There is a place where the dead and the living both come to drink, and neither complains about the other's manners. She folded the letter and tucked it under a rock by the marsh, the way you tuck a baby into sleep. The preacher found a new scripture, mercy. He preached it as if it had been hiding in his mouth the whole time. He looked out at his flock and saw that some had stopped coming. Others came and did not look at him. He learned a lesson he should have known. You can shepherd fear easy. You have to earn mercy fresh each Sunday. Harrow's men kept rolling drums at night. The river kept accepting them. The marsh kept taking what it was given and turning it into a memory of something better. But the piles grew. Fish began to appear in 2s and 3s along the bank with their mouths open as if surprised at the end of the world. Kids stopped swimming. A woman lost hair in clumps and blamed stress and then stopped saying that. And out in the long grass, where the frog song braided itself into something like prayer, the earth heaved once. The night after that, Two poachers walked into the marsh with a lantern and walked out with a story they would only tell drunk. A hill moved. A shadow stood. Something that smelled of rain lifted itself from a grave the size of the town's shame and walked east toward the river mouth. They left their lantern. It burned until morning when the water took it, and somewhere a shiner circled it, curious as any child. 11. The Last Vow. Mara followed the prints, great ovals in the silt, the staggered imprints of a being that was never meant to bear a body. She followed them past the new lilies that had learned to grow where nothing green had dared in years. She followed them to the culvert where the ditch that Harrow made met the mouth of the river, and there she stopped, because she could go no farther without crawling into the story so fully that nothing else would fit inside her. The Heap stood in the water to its waist. The current loved it the way a child loves a dog, too tight. The sun had not yet broken the low ceiling of cloud. The world glowed like a bruise. From here she could see that the slit in its middle, the bullet seam, had opened again. The marsh had packed it. Then the fire had taken the packing, and now the river worried at the wound like a tongue at a bad tooth. The Heap did not look back. It lifted both arms and put them into the culvert's mouth. It pushed. The concrete gave a little. The iron grating squealed. The Heap pushed again. The grating popped like a rib. The water swarmed in, trying to hold its savior and its enemy at the same time. The Heap did not stop. It found the pipe beyond and bent it, using a strength that was not muscle but accumulation. The strength of years of rot deciding to make itself useful. Mara saw the water change color in a ribbon that loosened like the world's worst sash. It went from white to gray to clean in pulses, as if a heart had found a different beat. The pipe cried out like an animal and then quieted. The ditch slowed. The drums upriver wore their caps in silence and thought about nothing. The Heap turned, slow with triumph and injury, and started back toward the marsh. Mara had her camera around her neck. She could have taken the shot, the one that would prove, convict, absolve, change. She lifted it, then lowered it. Instead, she stepped into the river to her knees. "Thank you," she said. She said it once and then again, because it felt wrong to say it only once. The Heap stopped. It stood in the water and listened to the word like it was a language it had almost remembered. A bell rang far away, or perhaps only inside Mara's chest, which had held too many small, selfish bells and not enough large, generous ones. The Heap bent. It put its palm against the water as if pledging. The current broke around it, not in anger but in awe. Then a shot cracked the morning. Harrow stood on the levee, clean as a ledger that hasn't yet been audited. His rifle was the kind you buy when you have no intention of missing. You could smell the money on it. The sheriff shouted something Mara did not hear because her ears were full of her heartbeat. The first shot hit the Heap in the shoulder and went in deep and stayed, which is the only honest thing a bullet can do. The second hit near the old wound. The third, men of Harrow's sort have always believed in threes, found the place where the peat and root had custom-boned themselves into a sternum. It made a hole. The Heap put a hand there automatically, the way men do. It looked at its own hand, perplexed, as if this body still surprised it even now. Then it took 2 steps toward the marsh, each slower than the last, and sank to one knee in water up to a man's belt. Jamie's scream came from the road. "No!" But the wind moved it away to a farm that did not need it. The sheriff grabbed Harrow's rifle and turned it aside, but the math had been done. The river did the rest. The Heap folded, not like a man, like a hill subsiding, like old weather returning to the sky. The marsh took him gently. Mud came up like hands at a funeral. Water parted to make a coffin, then closed. The cattails bent their heads. Harrow lowered his empty hands and tried to think of what to do with them when they weren't holding something that could lie for him. He turned to leave, to become a man in a suit in an office again, to write a check for the Christmas pageant. The sheriff, a man made entirely of reversed decisions, put his hand on Harrow's arm. "You're under arrest," he said. "For what?" Harrow laughed, genuinely baffled. "For everything," Mara said. She had her camera up now. She took the picture of Harrow's face that would run in a paper she would print herself. She took another of the sheriff's hand. She took none of the water because some truths do not need cameras. They have the marsh. Harrow's trial would be a mess. Money is slippery. Some of what he had done would never meet a courtroom. Some of it would be paid for. Some would cling to him like the smell of bleach until he died. Justice is a swamp, too. Do not ask me to make it tidy. But the pipe remained bent. The ditch ran clearer. The frogs returned like a choir that had refused to sing under the wrong maestro. 12. The Last Bubbles. That evening, Katya walked to the marsh with a clean scarf and a small loaf of bread tucked in its folds. She tore the loaf and tossed pieces into the water, not because anyone would eat them, but because that is what you do in the countries where the dead and the living both stand by the same water. You feed what can't be fed. You keep the habit. She sang. The song had no words in any language I can teach you. Do not ask for a translation. It was the sound people make when confronted with a goodness they are unworthy of and a loss they will not survive. The water made a shape. It might have been a shoulder. It might have been a trick of wind. Bubbles rose where the shape had been and popped, small, modest candles. Jamie stood with a stick he had whittled into a spear and did not throw it. He put it down and took Katya's hand because children, when allowed, are fluent in the first language. Mara stood behind them, no camera in her hands, because some nights the world does not need another witness. It needs someone to stand and be counted in silence. By full dark, the marsh looked like any marsh. Frogs argued. Mosquitoes piloted themselves into their small wars. The stars did what they always do, shone indifferently and beautifully. The river's mouth tugged at the shore as if to say, "Come with me. Come be part of something larger." The shore considered, wavered, held as shores hold. If you had stood there alone and listened hard, you might have heard something like a bell. 13. What remains? Cedar Hollow will tell you the story different depending on which booth at the diner you sit in. In one, the Heap is a demon, and Harrow is a righteous man misunderstood by the crawl of history. In another, the Heap is a saint, and Harrow is a devil, and the sheriff a man who woke up one morning with his hands finally remembering what they were for. In a third, the whole thing never happened, and the fish kills were an act of God, and we only did what we could. But the marsh keeps a better archive. It will show anyone willing to get their boots ruined the place where reeds grow thicker in a circle. It will show you the bent pipe. It will show you, if you are quiet and foolish in the right way, a braid of old cattail stalks across a ditch where boys now ride their bikes and never think about what the water once tried to do to their road. It will show you the print of a hand that fills with river water when it rains and reflects the sky back to itself. Some nights a fog comes in and lays down soft. On those nights, if you put your palm on the mud and promise something you have no right to promise, you will feel the earth answer. Put your body where the harm is. That is the only vow worth keeping. That is the only prayer the marsh believes. Jamie grew up and came back and left again and came back for good. He teaches kids to fish now without hooks when the marsh is spawning, and he has the kind of hands that don't mind getting dirty to make something clean. Sometimes he catches himself stepping between two children who are about to throw rocks at a snapping turtle, and he lowers their arms and says, "We don't do that." The boys look at him and for a moment do not recognize him. Then they do and put their rocks down, and someone's future changes by a quarter inch. Mara's paper caught. It did not make her rich. It made her indispensable. She prints this story once a year with a different picture each time, never the Heap's whole shape, always a market left, because she learned the hard way that showing the whole of a miracle kills it, and showing the trace keeps it alive. Katya married no one and was no one's mother, and kept more people alive than any woman in town by making soup like a sacrament. She walks to the marsh in a blue headscarf the color of sky as the painter meant it, and sometimes she sings. Not because anyone listens, but because sometimes the right listener has no ears, and that does not matter. The preacher stopped shouting. He took up the quiet work. Blankets, bread, beds. He preaches once a month now, and his sermons have half as many words and twice as much truth. Mr. Harrow's name is a joke in some mouths and a curse in others. The river is not concerned. It wears the names of men like rain wears street chalk. And the heap? The marsh remembers. That is its work. That is its holiness. On a certain kind of wind, the cattails all lean one way and then the other, and the frogs pause as if a shadow had moved over them, and the water trembles in a pattern that looks like footfalls. The pipe remains bent, which is a better memorial than stone. Children grow up not knowing why the lilies in one corner of the marsh are so bright. They become the kind of adults who, when a boy throws a rock at a miracle, take the rock gently out of his hand and give him a lunch instead. Listen. The marsh has one more thing to say. Not all tragedies end with a funeral or a gallows. Some end with a change in the water. Some end when a vow echoes long enough in mud to become a road. The heap is gone. That is the tragedy. The river runs a little cleaner. That is the price the world took, and this time, for once, it paid for what it took. If you go there at dawn, when the fog sits like an old woman keeping watch, put your hand to the mud and feel if it answers. If it does, do not be afraid. It is only the marsh telling you what the heap told it. Be the body between harm and the shore.